Hello, friends. Dr. David Katz, another COVID reality check. I suppose this one might be deemed a bit overdue, and there are several reasons for that. The first is, for a while there, the political pandemonium was more of a fixation even than the pandemic. And frankly, I couldn't put my heart into the next one of these while worrying about civil war. So glad that drama is behind us and we're moving on. The other thing is I had the great opportunity to do an extensive interview with ZDogg, and I posted that to this channel, so I trust some of you have seen that. And we covered many of the issues I would have covered in an interim reality check, so I didn't feel the need. And then finally, I have COVID. I'm actually waiting for my test result to come back, but my wife's test result, two of my daughter's test results, my son's test result, they've all come back positive. We all have the same symptoms, so there's no question about it. So I've been under the weather for a while, and frankly, not especially eager to have people see what I look like on video. But as you can see, I'm doing fine. I don't feel great, but I don't feel too badly either, and it hasn't been a terribly rough course. What I want to talk about in this Contempo update is mutation, frustration, mine, but I think prevailing frustration, and then great expectation. So first let's talk about mutation. That's probably the topic of the time with regard to the behavior of the virus itself. So as you've heard, there are a number of mutant strains now taking over around the world. The B117 strain in particular that emerged first in Britain and seems to propagate particularly well either is already or is becoming the predominant strain circulating in the U.S., but there are many other mutant strains being identified around the world. Most recently, one in South Africa has raised concerns about potential partial resistance to the vaccines and so forth. So we'll be hearing those anxieties for a while. The general story here is one of the arms race of evolutionary biology. Essentially, the pathogen is on one side, so SARS-CoV-2 is on one side, our immune system is on the other, and they compete, and anytime one side discovers an advantage, it puts it to good use. So if our immune system were to strike upon some new method of defending against SARS-CoV-2, those people who had that mutation would fare best. And in fact, there are many different expressions of immunity, and no doubt some genetic markers are among the factors that predispose people to really bad cases of COVID, and some genetic markers are among the factors that predispose people to mild cases of COVID, and essentially those are mutations affecting us. The difference, of course, is that with a virus, the generations come and go with astonishing speed, and they come and go in staggering numbers. And mutation basically is a game of numbers. Most mutations are either unimportant or disadvantageous. If you are any kind of organism and you're adapted to survive under particular circumstances, the likelihood that a change in your survival settings will be beneficial is rather remote. But because the numbers are so vast, with a virus circulating, so there are countless viral particles in circulation, millions or more in every individual, and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions infected around the world. You do that math, you get to staggeringly high numbers very fast. Well, with that vast population subject to mutation and with the rapid turnover of generations, any advantageous mutation, however rare, will take hold. Now, what's advantageous? The good news here is it's not advantageous to a parasite to kill its host. If you make your host terribly sick very fast and then kill your host, you basically lose your real estate. You make someone very sick, they take to bed, they're not out in the world to spread you. And if they die, you've just lost your world and you die too. So that's not advantageous, and that's good news. We should not expect that mutations that make this particular infection or any infection more severe are very likely to take over. They could, but only if they favor propagation. those are the mutations that prevail. If they make the virus better at spreading. So what would do that? Well, actually, mild illness is more likely to help spread a pathogen than severe illness, because people who are mildly sick stay out in the world and interact with other people. So it's in the interest of the virus for its effects on us to be mild, minimum, or negligible. The most successful parasites are actually symbionts. They don't hurt their host at all. They just take up resident, do no harm, and they can propagate there. At some point in the distant past, our own mitochondria were invading parasites. But they helped us. We gave them a place to live. Everybody wins. Those are the most successful parasites. So you don't want to kill your host. You don't even really want to hurt your host. But you do want to get out into the world so you can get from host to host. So making people cough, making people sneeze, which is why, of course, cold viruses are so prevalent, because they don't make us terribly sick. They don't make us take to bed. We stay out in the world. We cough, we sneeze. We spray them out into the air. They get to other people. So that's what's going on. So this was inevitable. This should surprise no one. Of course, there were going to be mutant strains. However, given the vast exposure to SARS-CoV-2 around the world, and the fact that the infection is serious, and that there may be no real advantage to the virus in becoming much milder. So in other words, the mutations that will be favored are the ones that advance propagation. They may not affect the severity of the disease at all. Then having lots of mutated strains that increase viral transmission is advantageous to SARS-CoV-2, but disadvantageous to us. What this means is we want to put an end to this mayhem as expeditiously as we possibly can. And given where we are in the pandemic, given the massive level of exposure, my family and I took all of the appropriate precautions. We wore masks, we socially distanced, we were quite careful, but the fact that we all got it anyway just shows that with readily transmissible strains so prevalent now, it's really, really hard to avoid. So we're not going to control the pandemic by keeping people and virus apart. We now need to control the pandemic by immunizing people against it. There are two ways that can happen now. We have the vaccine, so the vaccine is one. So effective, organized vaccine deployment is crucial. And on that front, it's very encouraging to see that the Biden administration is finally giving us leadership that looks grown up, looks serious, organized, disciplined, and a systematic plan for vaccine capacity is in play. It's pretty late in the game for that, but at least it's happening now. So I think we can expect to see fairly soon acceleration of vaccine production, more disciplined distribution, and ideally we will further risk stratify age groups so that the people who most need the vaccine get to the front of the line. So all of that looks reasonably encouraging. The only other way to get to immunity is to get the infection. This is the way that I'm doing it right now. You get the infection, you get over it, and you are subsequently immune. That leads to my frustration on two fronts. The first frustration I want to express actually relates to this issue of mutation. We've had the pandemic for a year now. That's a very long time. And the approach that I espoused at the beginning essentially emphasized that this was not a one-size-fits-all threat, and that we had the opportunity to risk stratify the population and say, the way to get a lot of people immune with minimal harm is to identify the people this infection doesn't tend to hurt, and allow them out in the world and monitor very closely. So if we're wrong, if people are being hurt, we withdraw. But if people are not being hurt, that's an entire cohort, young, generally healthy people who can get this, get over it, and each one of them who's immune becomes a dead end. And then the next wave out of people at just slightly higher risk, and then the next wave and the next wave. And what we might then have done is systematically built our way to herd immunity, which we have managed to turn into heresy, as I discussed in one of my previous videos. And of course, it's not heresy. The only way pandemics end is with herd immunity, when enough people are immune that the virus stops propagating. And you get there either naturally with exposure to the bug or with the advent of vaccines, or usually with a combination of the two. But the longer it takes, the more opportunity there is for a wide array of viral mutations that play to the advantage of the virus and against our own. So the timeline is not our friend here. And a year in, it's not surprising that we're seeing all of these mutant viral strains. We could have preempted that if we had approached this with vertical interdiction, risk stratified interdiction from the beginning. And you know, again, the notion that herd immunity is heretical, that's absurd, especially when you look around at the epidemiology we have now. Hundreds of millions of people have been exposed to this bug around the world. It's happening anyway. So, you know, essentially we allowed everybody to get exposed, even though we didn't want to, because we never thought about a systematic way of controlling the exposure. So, you know, given the choices between lock it all down or liberate it all, look where we wound up. We wound up at one another's throats and all subject to the ravages of the pandemic. If we had controlled our exposure in a risk stratified fashion, we could have accelerated the timeline, minimized the global exposure, truncated the pandemic curve in a way that would have mitigated against this proliferation of mutant strains. I'm frustrated that all of that didn't happen. I still, you know, with a year to look back on, think that total harm minimization was the right objective. Vertical or risk stratified interdiction was the right way to get there from here. And there still is value in risk stratification because it can help us allocate scarce resources optimally, even now. So by risk stratifying people, not just by age, but within age groups based on risk factors, we can optimize vaccine distribution and so forth. The other thing that I'm frustrated about is the fact that we've been at one another's throats. And this is something I cover extensively in my latest column, and of course I'll attach that link, entitled Dramedemiology, which is a neologism of my own devising. But you know, the data in this pandemic, 400,000 deaths now in the United States, over 2 million deaths around the world, they're perfectly dramatic enough. But I think by willfully hyperbolizing the drama in this situation, by talking about deaths from COVID but never comparing them to deaths from anything else, as if people didn't die of COVID, no one would die. By talking about deaths from COVID as tragic, but not talking about deaths from heart disease as tragic. By saying it's inadmissible to compare COVID to seasonal flu because it's 3, 4, maybe even 5 times worse than a typical flu year, but routinely comparing it to the great pandemic of 1918, and to be clear, it's more than 100 times less bad than that. So it's much closer. It's worse, for sure, than seasonal flu, but it's much closer to an average flu year than it is to the great pandemic of 1918. And again, I'll provide links that show, just with the basic math, that pandemic on a global scale, at least thus far into COVID, was more than 100 times greater in terms of the total impact, casualties, deaths around the world. So there was this consistent overlay of drama that essentially called for constant hyperbole and the failure to deliver context. You can only understand epidemiologic figures in context. If I tell you, for example, headline, 3 million people die over past year in the United States. Well, should you panic? Is the sky falling? Is it the apocalypse? Is it the end of the world? You have no idea because I've given you no context. If I then say, by the way, approximately 3 million people die in the United States every year because we're a population of 330 million people with a given age distribution, and more than that many are born, and this is just the great circle of life. We're mortal. We get old and we die. And every year, just about 1%, a little less than 1% of the population turns over. If I tell you that, all of a sudden what could have been extremely dramatic with no context becomes quite routine information with context. Well, I argue that we have failed to provide people with context. And again, I elaborate on that in the column. So for those of you who have the inclination to watch a video and do some reading, I commend it to you and provide the links. So those are my frustrations. I think we could have avoided the challenges of all these mutant strains. I certainly think we could have avoided the addition of insulting one another to the injury of the pandemic if we had been more committed to the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth in our reporting of what was going on. The data are dramatic enough. We didn't need the willful superimposition of drama, but we had it. So So there you have my discussion of mutation, frustration. I also have great expectation. As I record this, there's news out today via NPR and other sources that scientists around the country who are monitoring what's happening in hospitals and hard-hit places are beginning to note that we're over the peak of this surge, that case counts are starting to decline, hospital quotas are starting to come down. In other words, the worst that this winter had to give us may be behind us now. And of course, that's very good news. As you know, those of you who've watched these videos, I predicted an earlier end to the pandemic because I thought we had high enough exposure some months back. So may prove to be off by a few months, and that's important because we've suffered a great deal in the last couple of months. But the same basic process is playing out. When enough people have been exposed to this, infected, become immune, and it's behind them, everybody who has immunity is a dead end in viral propagation, and consequently the transmission of the virus will decline steadily. And I had hoped we'd be there in October. Here we are in January. It hasn't happened yet, but it looks like it's not too far off. That's very encouraging news. Of course, we'll get through the winter months. There tends to be an advantage as we get into the spring anyway. But with these very high levels of exposure all around the country and increasingly all around the world, and with the promise of vaccine distribution, disciplined plans to ramp up production, equitable distribution, a lot of really promising signs. So I definitely do see the light at the end of this tunnel, and I am very confident it is not the headlights of an oncoming train. And I do think it's meaningful that I'm recording this message to share with all of you as I actually have this bug and I'm experiencing it. And I can tell you, it's odd. It's not fun. And you know, so you know, I've probably shared this before. I'm 58 years old, or about to be. I'm unusually healthy as a lifestyle medicine, preventive medicine specialist who practices what I preach. You know, it's not surprising. My health is unusually good. So I have a COVID age, and by the way, I'll attach a link to a risk calculator that tells you that, what is your COVID age, courtesy of my friends at Everest Health. I have a COVID age that's considerably younger than my chronological age. So I expected all along if I encountered this bug, I'd have a pretty mild course. And indeed, that's true, but it's not fun. I would rather not be sick, and I intended to get the vaccine when it became available to me. Depending on whether or not I have demonstrable IgG antibodies after this, may very well still make sense. The vaccine is being recommended at this point, even to people who've gotten over the infection. I suppose a brief comment about the vaccines is warranted. You've certainly seen the reports about anaphylaxis. The calculation in medicine is always about risk-benefit trade-offs. There's nothing we do in medicine that involves zero risk, and very little we do in life that involves zero risk. We take a calculated risk every time we cross a street. So the fact that it's possible to have a severe allergic reaction to, in particular, the Pfizer vaccine, and that it seems to occur at a higher rate than some other vaccines, it's worth knowing. It's worth preparing. If you are at high risk of severe allergic reactions, you want to carefully vet this with doctors who know you well. Anybody getting this vaccine should be in a place where there is available right then and there the means to treat severe allergic reactions. So there are obviously precautions that are required, but it's still a very rare reaction. And all we really need to embrace the availability of vaccines is that they offer us the return to life as we knew it before, essentially the ability to go about our business and not worrying about a life-threatening illness at a much lower risk than the virus itself. So as we speak, my brother-in-law, who's got some chronic health issues, is being vaccinated today. My mother, who is 81 years old and managed to avoid the virus, thank goodness, is being vaccinated today. My father, who is 81 and still a practicing cardiologist, so both in the high-risk age group and a frontline clinician, was already vaccinated, I think is awaiting his second dose now. And I'm totally in favor of all of that. So, I always put myself and my loved ones where my advice is, doing the same here. I'm not on the front lines now, so I'm not an immediate candidate for the vaccine, but I'm completely receptive to it. It's not that it's perfect. It just needs to be a whole lot better than the virus. And as I've written about in prior columns, that's not a terribly difficult bar to clear. I'm quite confident that the available vaccines are. So at this point, there really are a lot of favorable signs. And just to loop back to the issue of mutation, although there is inevitably speculation, anxious speculation that you can find online and in the scientific literature about resistance to vaccines, there's no clear evidence of that at this point. And in fact, the strains that have started to take over already, like B117, clearly are included in the protection conferred by the vaccine. So that's not yet a real world worry. It's a hypothetical worry, and the best way to defend against that is to put an end to this by the means at our disposal as expeditiously as we can. So again, I'll attach links to other items I hope may be of interest. Until next time, if there needs to be a next time, I hope you all stay well.